starting out with probably the most classic of all time, which would be water bath.
So water bath canning is what most people think of when they think of canning. Like especially memories back, like maybe mom, maybe grandma, maybe great grandma, where there's a big old pot of boiling water on the stove and you're putting your jars in that boiling water. When the food's in there, goes through a processing time, and then you're pulling them out. So it's the easiest method of entry when it comes to canning, simply because you don't have to buy a pressure canner. And truly, to water bath can, you don't even have to buy a water bath canner. As long as you have a pot that is deep enough that when the jar that's full of whatever it is you're water bathing, usually jam or pickles, is in the water with the lid and the band on, fully submerged, the level of the water is at least 1 inch over the top of the jars, and that you've got something in the bottom that's lifting the jars up off the very bottom of the pot. So if you buy a water bath canner, they come with racks. You can buy racks. But if you're just using a big pot, especially for things like jam and jelly that are typically done in the smaller jars, not like the big quart jars you're doing pickles and stuff in, you can just use a big like stew pot. And then you can either use your extra bands, so that the screw down bands when you're canning. You can just create a little rack in the bottom of your pan with those. You can even take the towel, like a dish towel, and twist it up because it's fully submerged in water. Put that down there, and it acts as a cushion for the jars. But what we really want is, we don't want the jars directly on the heat source. We want that up so that the heat can evenly distribute all the way around and you don't have any hot spots. So if you do that and then a lid, and even if you don't have a lid for your big pot, like sometimes, I don't know, lids go missing, you can use a cookie sheet. You can really make a lid out of anything that will fit over the pot. So truthfully, there's like no barrier to entry, I feel like, when it comes to water bath canning. Like pretty much everybody's already got those supplies on hand and can jump straight into it. So as far as an overview on it, on how it works, is water bath canning is for acidic foods, specifically pH level of 4.6 or lower on the pH scale. And the reason for that is because botulism, which is pretty much everybody's has heard with canning, that's kind of what goes hand in hand, is fear of botulism. And rightly so. I mean, botulism is not just a form of food poisoning. It's actually a neurotoxin and it can be fatal. However, it's super easy to avoid if you just follow the basic canning rules and science. And so botulism, the toxin, isn't able to grow in an acidic environment of that 4.6 pH or lower, and this acidity wise. So that's why it's safe to do most jams and jellies. The exceptions is non-acidic fruits. So things like bananas that aren't already acidic, you shouldn't can, like banana butter. That's not something that's going to be safe for canning because it's a pH level and there's some density issues there. But that's why you can do apple butter. You can do almost any type of fruit as a jam, jelly. And when you're pickling vegetables, because you're pickling them with your vinegar and water to a specific brine ratio, then that is able to get through the density of the vegetables through the pickling and the water bath process. Therefore, everything inside the jar is then lowered to that 4.6 pH. So in a nutshell, that's why we can safely water bath can acidic recipes and foods, but not the non-acidic.
I see. And in the case of bananas, because as you say banana butter, I'm like, it sounds actually pretty fire. Like I'd like to try it, but it's because the banana is such a dense material that it's hard for that water to penetrate all the way through. Is that part of it?
There is density when it comes to canning and pickling, but in the instance of the banana, actually, it's same thing with pumpkin. So neither of those are acidic. And so it's not even necessarily the density, though there is issue with density. The density is more when we look at pickling. And then even with pressure canning, there's some density issues. So with pickling, for example, most like cucumbers, beets, asparagus, green beans, there's a lot of vegetables that you can pickle. However, one of the things that you shouldn't pickle is, and can, let me preface that, canning wise, is pickled eggs. And the reason for that is, even if you are using your brine that is acidic enough, so that's usually equal parts vinegar and water, 5% vinegar, I should specify, 5% vinegar with water, equal parts. Generally speaking, sometimes you'll see a few recipes like asparagus that might have a little bit higher level of vinegar to water, but you should never can a recipe that's a pickling recipe if it uses more water than vinegar. Because you're running the risk of not being in that correct pH. But back to the pickled eggs example, the pickled eggs, even if you are using the vinegar water correct ratio, the egg is so dense that the vinegar can't get all the way through the egg into the center enough
Okay.
to fully get the center of that pickled egg at that pH level that we'd need in order for it to be safely canned. So you can make your
Uh,
pickled eggs, throw them babies in the fridge. They're just not a water bath canning candidate for shelf stability.
okay, got it. Yeah. So that's the separation I was trying to figure out is some foods, it's the acidity might be okay, but the water solution can't actually penetrate deep enough. So you have sort of a semi uncanned center, so to speak, in the
Yeah,
middle of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Interesting. Why do you think water bath canning, unless you disagree, feels intimidating to someone who's starting out?
I think with canning, I think more people are intimidated by the pressure canner
Yeah.
because obviously that's under pressure. Things can could explode. Though newer canners, and by newer I mean like made 1980s or newer, have a lot more safety features built into them than a lot of the original pressure canners in the past, which is usually where the majority of the stories come from. Like my grandmother blew up a pressure canner.
Oh,
That
wow.
type, like you hear those things, right? And so I think people get
Like
a little
top
bit
popping
nervous.
off type thing?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is super easy to avoid, especially with the models that they have out today. There's so many safety features that they've built in since then. It's I shouldn't say that it couldn't happen because I try to never use absolutes, but it's very difficult for it to happen now, almost unheard of.
I
But
have the
yeah,
Presto digital electric one, which I think is relatively new. And so, yeah, that's the first time. I mean, I've water bath canned before, but it wasn't like a super regular practice. And the pressure canner is kind of the thing I've been going to. And it is a little inherent fear, I suppose, because you realize what pressures it. But I've cooked in an instant pot as well, and it's
yeah.
not that scary, you know.
I think it's more, I think with canning, more so, yeah, because I love my Instant Pot. I am a modern homesteader. I love the traditional skill sets, but I also will use, modern conveniences to help meld because I do live in a modern time. I think a lot of it is just that people have heard about botulism. And if you weren't raised with someone who canned, like it wasn't common to you, it wasn't something you were around. I think it's just more the fear of the unknown, right? Just things that we're not used to doing. And people are like, I don't want to make my family sick because most people have heard you got to watch out for botulism with home canned food. So I think it's a little bit of those two things together.
Would you say there's an absolute beginner go-to one or two things to try water bath canning? Sounds like maybe some sort of jam in a small jar, just so that guarantees someone actually has a pot already in their kitchen, right?
For the easiest like barrier to enter when it comes to water bath canning, like picking a recipe, honestly would be water bath canning some fruit without even making it into jam or jelly, because then it's learning how to use pectin and getting it to set, right? So it's not too thin, and you actually get a jam or jelly that gels. So truly easiest would be doing something like, half pears,
Mm.
taking your pears, canning some pears or some apples or even berries, peaches, anything like that, where you're just putting them in the jar. And then you can do water, you can do a light sugar syrup, you can even do a honey syrup. That's going to be a really easy thing to do. Or pickling, honestly, something like pickled green beans or pickled asparagus. You're just mixing up your brine with some spices to flavor it for your pickling flavor, putting the vegetables in the jar, pouring that hot brine over it, getting out your air bubbles, and then processing it in the water bath canner. Like those are really easy because you don't have the complexity of, oh man, it didn't gel, getting that consistency part right for your jam or jelly. I think some people sometimes feel intimidated by that even. So I
Hmm.
would say pickling or fruit.
How often are you pressure canning versus water bath? Do you have a favorite, or is it just kind of dependent?
It's really just kind of dependent. I would honestly say, though, if I did have a favorite, it probably honestly would be the pressure canner. And I
Okay.
think the reason for that is usually when it comes to pressure canning, there's actually less prep work for most of the recipes, with the exception of like tomato sauce and maybe salsa. But like when I'm just canning meat and vegetables, it's pretty straightforward and fast. It's much less work than actually making like jam or jelly or fruit butters or some of those other things. I'm just putting the meat and the vegetables. If I'm doing a raw pack, I'm literally putting them raw in the jar. For vegetables, you're going to be using boiling water that goes over that. And then I'm putting them in the pressure canner and able to then just do other stuff in the kitchen while it's going, keeping an ear on it for the time, but really
Hmm.
less hands-on work for me. And I think I love to especially with the pressure canner, because you can do those vegetables and meats and broths and soups and stews. And so then on the back end, when we're really busy and I don't have time to prep or cook dinner, I can literally just go to the shelf, pull these things off, assemble them, or just heat them up. And I've got homegrown, home cooked dinner on the table in like 10 to 15 minutes. So I think knowing that that's the end game that I get, like the result, really makes it my favorite.
Yeah, I have to say I don't have as much experience as you do in really either method, but the pressure canning was super enjoyable. We actually did it outside. We ran around harvesting. It was peppers, onions, tomatoes to make this salsa, and cutting them up, packing, etc. And then at least with the one I have, it takes you through the process and kind of stair steps you through, and you're sort of just pressing a few buttons along the way. And it still takes quite a bit of time. I think it was like at least a couple hours to do 3 or 4 jars, but I still have them, and it's January of the following year. I'm not like crushing salsa that much. So I guess I was curious, like when you're talking about grabbing quick meals off the shelf in the pantry, are you getting into canning some of the more unconventional things like the meats or some of the things that maybe you couldn't pull off in a water bath system?
Yeah. So for pressure canning, a pressure canner allows you to safely can non-acidic foods. So that's of course going to be your, meat, chicken, beef, all your different types of poultry, all of your broths. So vegetable broth, beef broth, chicken broth, bone broths. And then, of course, all of your non-pickled vegetables, so green beans. And you can also pressure can some of those acidic recipes that can actually go either way. So, for example, tomato sauce and salsa and tomatoes, you can safely water bath can those with the addition of citric acid, bottled lemon juice, because they're borderline. Tomatoes are borderline acidity. So we add those. But you can safely water bath can those, but you can also pressure can tomato products as well. And I usually end up pressure canning them because the pressure canning time is less time than the water bath time. And I'm kind of like, well, if I can, run a piece of equipment and I've only got to process something for 30 minutes versus an hour, I'm going to go for the 30 minutes because that's just, it's much more time efficient. And also, I have the All-American, so I can do 7 quarts at one time, or I can do 19 pints at one time. So for me, it's kind of the same amount of energy to run that canner. So if I can get 19 jars in that bad boy at once, then I'm all about that. So
yeah, I mean, that's easy.
Watch the full episode right here and subscribe for more new episodes every single week.